Vayamos haciendo un lado, tu color y mi color, tu color y mi color. Vayamos haciendo un lado.
Vayamos haciendo un lado, tu color y mi color, tu color y mi color. Vayamos haciendo un lado.
Ya no tenemos razón para ignorar el amor, para ignorar el amor. Es tiempo de reflexión.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm John Fanistil, Executive Director at VIA International, and on behalf of the entire team here at VIA International and the VIA Cafe, we welcome you to Las Noticias from the Border. This is a weekly show where we check in with leaders and allies and friends from along and across the US-Mexico border, especially here in the San Diego-Tijuana region, and we look at things that are happening in the news from the perspective of the US-Mexico border. I'm going to introduce our guests, Jim Gerber and Carmen Chavez, in just a minute, but I want to begin today with just a quick comment on something that I just came to my attention a few days ago. I don't know, some of you may have seen it on 60 Minutes this just past Sunday. They did a segment on part of the border wall that was built by private companies and private owners along the Rio Grande in Texas. And the story illustrates something that I think of as a theme of conversation, which is how much of a mess of things the US federal government can make along the US-Mexico border for their lack of understanding of what life is really like along the border. I'll put the link to the 60 Minutes piece in our chat room here in Zoom, and we'll make it available on Facebook as well, if any of you would like to watch the entire segment. But the long and short of it is that after Donald Trump's election, a guy created a campaign called We Build the Wall and raised tens of millions of dollars from people promising to build segments of the US-Mexico border wall using private donations, a fellow named Brian 𝗚𝗲𝗿𝗍. No surprise, Steve Bannon loved the idea and jumped in on it. And they raised tens of millions of dollars and then contracted with a company, a Fisher Sand and Gravel company out of North Dakota. And they actually built between 3 and 4 miles of wall with private contracts. 3 of those miles were built right along the Rio Grande River. They built too close to the river. And by the time they'd finished, there was already signs of erosion, and engineers were clear that the wall wasn't going to last. And in fact, subsequent to that construction, the US federal government went ahead and built an additional wall over the same stretch of territory because they saw that the private wall that had been built was not up to code. Well, the sad news of all of this is that this company, Fisher Sand and Gravel from North Dakota, leveraged their construction along of this private wall and got billions of dollars of contracts from the US federal government to then build more border wall in places where there's really no rhyme or reason for it along the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. This is a subject of investigation now as to how a contractor was able to procure such a lucrative contract after having done shoddy work. You can imagine, as I can, some of the reasons for that. But I thought that story, that sad story, illustrated just how messy things can get when decision-making is in the hands of people who are far, far away. The real tragic end to that story, or I guess we may not have seen the end of it, but another tragic chapter in that story, and this you may have seen in the news, is that the leader of that campaign, Brian 𝗚𝗍𝗍𝗍, and Steve Bannon himself have now been arrested and charged with misallocation of funds that were donated by these private donors to this We Build the Wall campaign. So I thought I'd raise that just to illustrate, you could count it a cry of lament, I guess, from me, as to how messy things can get here on the US-Mexico border, and especially in the sense that so often people who are in decision-making power, positions of decision-making power, or people who are, very passionate about the border, but don't really understand the border, and then perhaps even seek to take advantage of it or use it to their own purposes. Well, there's my opening soliloquy for today. Thank you again for joining us. It's such a pleasure for me to introduce our 2 guests, Jim Gerber and Carmen Chavez. And I'm going to ask them each to share a little bit about what they're presently working on And then we'll have some shared conversation, perhaps especially around this theme of US border policy, especially as that policy, economic policy, legal policy, is driven by people who live very far away from the border. So I'm going to begin with Carmen Chavez. Carmen is the executive director of the Casa Cornelia Law Center, and just had a lovely feature write-up in the San Diego Union Tribune celebrating her 25 years with Casa Cornelia. So we join the Union Tribune and their readers in congratulating Carmen on 25 years of work. And I'll invite you to join me in welcoming her with a round of applause as we welcome Carmen Chavez to Las Noticias from the border. Carmen, ¿qué hay de nuevo?
Pues, ¿qué hay de nuevo? Todos los días hay algo nuevo.
Así es la vida.
I'm delighted to be here with all of you. So for the last 27 years, the organization that I represent, Casa Cornelia Law Center, has been providing free legal services to victims of human and civil rights violations. So we continue to do that to this day. And we have focused as an organization on the most vulnerable amongst the immigrant community. And so specifically we focus on, because immigration is federal law. I should start with that. And so Congress makes immigration law, and the shaping of immigration policy comes through different factors, all of which are federal. So that is in the world in which we exist. And being here at the busiest land border of the world, this port of entry, we have 3 ports of entry in San Diego County, right? We have San Isidro, we have Otay Mesa, and we have Tecate. So it's an extremely important region. And what's been new is that it's new and not new, because we have continued our representation, and we'll probably talk more about the current circumstance, but we have continued to focus our energies in representing asylum seekers that have come from all over the world, not just Latin America, but also some African nations as well. Some are detained because it's a detention facility in Otay Mesa, some are not detained. So those court cases that are currently pending, those have continued, that hasn't stopped. The immigration court process has not stopped for those that are detained.
And Carmen, can I just interrupt there quickly? Are those court cases being heard live, or are they being heard virtually? And how much of your work now has gone virtual? Are you able to, have you been continuing to work out of your offices, or is it a hybrid, a mix of things, or how's that whole experience?
Right. As it relates to our staff and myself, we've been working largely remotely. However, we do cycle into the office. There's some work that just needs to get done in the office. Court hearings have largely been virtual, meaning either phone, maybe some video, but largely phone. However, recently we did have attorneys that had to go into court for an actual merits hearing or trial. And so immigration court, they're administrative law courts, and they run under different rules than judicial branch courts like the Superior Court or the Federal District Court. So it has been a hybrid, to answer your question. It has definitely been a hybrid.
Yeah, I see.
It has its own challenges in and of itself.
Yeah, because I know you all work a lot with translators, and I can imagine that adds another layer of complexity. Maybe we'll get into that in greater detail. But am I right that you're also then having to transport translators into some of these hearings and include that?
Right. So the immigration court itself contracts with interpreters for the hearings.
I see. So
we don't need to bring in interpreters for the hearings. However, in terms of preparing filings, paperwork, declarations, being able to speak to the clients directly, the majority of our staff speaks Spanish, but if it's another language of which we don't have internal capacity, then we do need to rely on the goodwill of the community for volunteer interpreters and translators for documents, because anything in a foreign language has to be translated into English and has to be certified. So all of that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. So yes. Yeah.
Well, Carmen, we're so glad to have you with us today, and I'll look forward to unpacking some more about that. I'm especially interested to hear about your experience with not just the courts, but also the detention centers during this time of COVID, where we hear so many stories about, conditions that are already extreme in these detention centers, and they're now getting worse. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's a question I want to ask you in just a minute. But let me first introduce our other guest, Jim Gerber. Jim Gerber retired from San Diego State after 34 years working as an economics professor and also heading up the Latin American Studies Department for a portion of that time. And Jim's a good friend of VIA International and many other community-based organizations here in San Diego. And so I'm going to welcome Jim and invite you to join me in giving Jim a round of applause as we welcome him to Las Noticias from the border. Jim, same question for you. ¿Qué hay de nuevo? What are you working on these days? What's keeping you busy?
Thank you, John, and thank you for the invitation. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I just want to say, first of all, it's an honor to be on the same platform as Carmen Chavez, and 𝗚𝗲𝗿𝗯𝗲𝗿 is one of the great organizations, San Diego-based organizations that does just tremendous work. And so I'm happy and honored to be able to you know, meet with you all at the same time that she's here. So I retired from teaching, but mostly so I could focus more on research and mostly border-related research, U.S.-Mexico economic relations. I'm an economic historian as well as an international economist. And what I'm most interested in right now is looking at how the two sides of the border, the economies of the two sides of the border have co-evolved over, I'll call it, you know, co-evolved over the 20th century. We've argued, there's a big literature out there and a lot of debate about, are we integrated? You know, is San Diego, Tijuana, is this one region or two regions? Is it an integrated region? And there are arguments on both sides of that. It's a complicated question. You know, I decided I wanted to get out of that discussion. I don't want to argue about, yes, we're integrated, no, we're not integrated. So what I wanted to focus on really is the subtle ways that we don't perceive, but are ongoing, and it ranges from really small little things to quite large and important things, how changes on one side of the border cause responses on the other side, and over the long period of time, how our two economies and societies, all of the other things, peripheral areas around the economy have changed together, how we influence each other, how we interact in ways that aren't perceived and don't depend upon the normal indicators of economic integration. You know, just to give you a couple of examples, I mean, there's some really obvious big cases of this that you can think about. You know, the one that's easiest to see and to cite is that, you know, the U.S. passes in the teens, in the second decade of the 20th century, prohibition laws.
Yeah.
So what happens in Mexico? The border economy of Mexico becomes focused on tourism. You know, that becomes a really big part of the shape, this overall structure of the economy. You know, another one we could say, and this is playing out today in some ways, is that when Mexico had this long period of its economic policy in which it was inward focused, it was really not trying to be out in the world so much. It wanted to be a bit more independent, separate, autonomous from the U.S. It's this period of inward-looking economic policies in which they limited imports of all kinds. So what happens on the U.S. side of the border? The communities on the U.S. side of the border develop these abnormally large retail sectors. So if you get, particularly outside of San Diego, if you go to the rest of the border, on the U.S. side, they've got larger than average retail sectors compared to other cities and towns of the same size elsewhere in the U.S. because they're servicing a Mexican population as well as their own domestic population. This is important today because what's happened with the border closing, you know, places like San Isidro, you can see this. You can see this in El Paso. You can see it in a lot of other communities. They're hurting. They're really hurting because they no longer have these people crossing the border in order to go to Walmart and Costco and elsewhere. So that's kind of what I'm working on right now.
That's great.
Tell this story.
Yeah, you know, your comment about the kind of back and forth reminds me of conversations I've had with Border Patrol officials here in San Diego who say it's a game of cat and mouse because we adapt one strategies and then the folks on the other side adapt. In one of those conversations, a friend of mine said, "No, it's not a game of cat and mouse. It's a dance. Es un baile." And kind of each partner responding to the other. I hear some of that in what you're describing.
Yeah.
Well, very good. Well, Jim and Carmen, thanks so much. And I'm gonna, we'll try to, maybe we can pin both of you to our screen here, and that way we can chat, just open up the conversation. Again, I thought it'd be fun because I knew enough about the work that each of you do to talk about this question of US federal policy and how often it's shaped by politicians and policymakers who live very, very far from the border. Of course, this is true in Mexico as well. I was by happenstance in a conference call with some folks from Mexico City earlier this week, and I realized, oh, they needed an orientation to San Diego, Tijuana. They weren't all that familiar with life on the ground. So, but as you think about the U.S. policy along the border, I wonder, is there a specific incident that you can recall where you really realized that someone you were talking to just didn't really get how the border worked, or needed that kind of introduction or orientation to life on the border, or a policy that struck you as, wow, that was somebody who really didn't quite get what life on the border is like? Is there a specific story or incident that comes to either of your minds?
Well, there's probably a few that I can share, but there was in one of the trips that I took back east to go to Washington, I met with a few of our elected officials. This is a few years back, and surprisingly, those that were not from the border, even those that were from the border region, but definitely those that weren't from the border region, kind of a recap of painting a picture of the very dynamic nature of our international border and our here, right here in the San Diego, Tijuana region, not just in terms of immigration, but in terms of economics, trade, commerce, ideas, people that go back and forth, U.S. citizens that live just south of the border for economic reasons, U.S. citizen children that live in Tijuana and cross the border every day to attend the schools. And so this kind of give and take, because oftentimes they're so zeroed in and focused on, you know, those migrants or those unaccompanied children or those asylum seekers, and they have very generalized ideas even of who they are or what they're fleeing or why they're there. But on top of that, just about the region in and of itself, and just how incredibly strong and yet delicate it can be, and how dynamic it is of the ebb and the flow of human beings. So it always astounds me, because if you're going to represent, you should probably have a really good understanding. But obviously those that have, they probably have never even been to the border themselves.
Yeah.
The only thing they can rely on is movies, a report, maybe they watch something on CNN or what have you, 60 Minutes, and that's what they rely on. So there's a constant educational process.
Yeah, and it's always struck me that, you know, so much of our policy, again, the last 25, 30 years has been focused on hardening the border, that of course the news stories are about those hardening strategies. It's border walls and cracking down at ports of entry and, you know, closing down. That becomes the whole of the narrative, doesn't it? So often in the mainstream news, at least when I see it. Jim, how about you? Do you have a recollection or an incident or a story of some of this kind of disconnect?
I would second everything Carmen said, and you know, it seems to me that oftentimes the people that make policy in Washington have an idea of the border as this line, and south of the line it's Mexico, north of the line it's the United States, and those things are completely separate in their mind. But what policy doesn't usually get is how fluid life can be for large segments of the population. Not everybody, but for significant numbers of people that have family on one side, or on both sides, I should say, that cross daily to work or for whatever reason. One incident that I recall that was just so frustrating and clear about this was when I was Director of Latin American Studies at San Diego State. I was working on trying to make it easier for students in universities in Tijuana to take classes at San Diego State, and easier for San Diego State students to go to 𝗚𝗲𝗿𝗍 or to COLEF or CETIS, other schools. And I thought, you know, this is the way forward for US Mexico, is that we have more interaction. and that why, you know, given the geography, why couldn't you be at 𝗚𝗲𝗿𝗍 on Monday and Wednesday and San Diego State on Tuesday and Thursday? Well, it turns out you don't get a student visa unless you're a full-time student. We couldn't do that kind of obvious sort of process that would have, I think, helped SDSU students learn about Mexico and Mexican students see the US a little bit more clearly.
So there is no such thing as a visa category for that kind of binational learning experience or student.
It eventually was developed,
I see.
but it's low key and they don't want to talk about it and they don't promote it and it's kind of hard to get.
Yeah, I think I recall, it may have been you, Jim, once somebody telling me that they were chatting with a PhD here, even in Southern California, and the person said there are universities in Tijuana.
Yeah, yeah, that was a colleague of mine.
So that it's not just people far away geographically from the board. Sometimes people live in their bubbles and can be unaware or uninformed even who are nearby. But well, let's shift to some more current breaking news. And Carmen, again from a distance, I've just been reading about the asylum, of course, and we actually via International is engaged deeply with several communities of migrants and several of the migrant shelters in Tijuana. As our other people in this call engaged with those populations. What have you seen? We're reading in the news certainly about the clamping down, almost the closing off of asylum, but it sounds like you all are staying busy. Is asylum still being granted? And what's the status of asylum applications, under the current legal regime? Oops, your microphone.
All right. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. So what we know is through the MPP program that now is it was instituted in January of 2019. So it is almost getting close to the 2-year mark. It has created a corridor of misery for those that are stuck in Tijuana, unable to have an opportunity to be heard and honestly their due process, be able to fulfill their due process rights and be able to apply for the relief that they feel that they are eligible for. So that has been ongoing with the closure of the border, which is currently in place. It has, and the closure of the court hearings of which those that are subject to MPP, that they have to appear at the court and then they get bussed into court and they have to appear in court. Their hearings have been held off in abeyance indefinitely right now. The border, as we know, is closed. So those persons cannot enter. Globally, there continues to be incredible civil strife, and regardless, if hopefully no one feels too bitter, but the United States continues to be a beacon of light for freedom and safety and being able to start a new life. And so not just persons that are Spanish speaking from Spanish speaking countries, but there's also a lot of persons from African countries such as Cameroon, Democratic Republic of Congo, Ghana. There's that I wanted to add that about the border is that it's not just Mexico and US. We're talking about it's a window to the world. So that continues to do that. Now, having said that, there was cases that were already pending.
Gotcha.
So those are the cases that we've been handling, and we handle asylum cases. We also represent all the detained unaccompanied children who are in San Diego County. So that requires a lot of work as well. And of course, that with the border situation, that has also affected that flow. So yes, there's less cases. Nonetheless, there's still cases.
Yes.
Having said all that,
and
I don't have a clear answer for all of you, there are still some persons that somehow are being accepted, are being placed. They may not be from Central America, they might be from other countries, and are being put into what is called removal proceedings. They have to go to immigration court. So how does that happen? I don't have the answer to that. But so you have those three different groups of individuals, cases that were pending before, cases that are affected by MPP, and then the one-offs that somehow What
Yeah.
we know is that there's a lot of discretion at the port of entry from
Gotcha.
the officials there. So why does somebody get to go in and someone else didn't? I don't have the answer for you.
Yeah. Quién sabe, huh? So,
Quién sabe?
so you describe what it feels, you're sort of describing to me a kind of a tightening or a narrowing of the funnel or it was migration, MPP is migration policy protocols, right? There were January 2019. I remember that was a big stir after the big news about the caravan that arrived in Tijuana in the fall of 2018. I think that was some of the rationale that I heard for the response was to, but then, the closure of the border this year. So this kind of tightening of this historic channel of asylum applications that goes back decades and decades, generations.
Correct.
Really. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. And then the detention center, I want to come back to, you mentioned the children, and I also want to ask you about that. Let me just throw a quick question to Jim, but then I want to make sure we get back to this issue of children, because I at least feel like I hear different things in the news about, how it is and whether children are still being separated from families. But Jim, let me ask you just quickly, how do you see the economic policy of the U.S. economic policy, especially in the wake of the COVID crisis? How do you see that playing out, and maybe especially here in the border region? Do you see policy decisions from afar that are having their effects on the ground here locally?
Well, as an economist, that we need another relief package, and a big one. We need more support for people that have lost their jobs. We need a whole bunch of things. We need broadband access for everybody. There's no reason why we couldn't be building that out right now, so that kids in places without connections can connect to their school. We need them to have laptops and accessibility. We really need the income support programs. And I think, that's not specifically a border problem, but it's the overriding issue right now, I think, is in terms of what we need. And it doesn't look like Congress is predisposed. Now, once the Republicans lose power, then suddenly the deficit will become a big deal for them again, whereas it wasn't before.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
Yeah, and then you mentioned, and we chatted last week with Jason Welch from the San Ysidro Chamber of Commerce about this devastating effect on border communities when you close down the border, you're cutting off, especially Jason was emphasizing the pedestrian commerce that comes with people walking across from Tijuana into San Ysidro. The border economies, you were describing them as back and forth, sort of this kind of evolution. You see San Diegans and Tijuanenses having to adapt to this new environment. What do you see people? How do you see people?
Right now it's like a poison working itself through our system, and if we keep drinking the poison, it could really harm the cross-border environment. But if we can, get the poison out of our system, my sense is that in the long run, that there's a growing cross-border community. There's growing a lot of goodwill, I think, on both sides of the border towards the other side, among substantial parts of the population. And I see that continuing to grow and develop, as long as it's not being blocked by the policies like the ones that we currently have.
Yeah. Well, very good. Well, Carmen, let me ask you then about the children. Was such a huge story, of course. Again, in that kind of 2 years ago time frame, seems to have fallen out of the news, and yet I hear still that there are instances, and I understand that there might be some circumstances in which there's suspicion of children being smuggled by non-custodial adults and so forth. But are children still being separated from parents? Are there still instances of that happening? And what becomes of those children, either that have been separated already or the ones that are still being separated now?
Another big question. I would say that the children they might fall in two different situations. One is a truly unaccompanied child. That means a child that's 17 or younger that has traveled by themselves without a parent or a guardian.
Mm-hmm.
So there is no family separation there because they have traveled by themselves. And that's the majority of the child clients that we represent. Since 2014, there has been an increase in the number of unaccompanied children that have come, and then it dropped off just a little bit. But on average, we had seen about 900 to 1,000 children here, just here in our own San Diego County, of unaccompanied children.
Yeah.
So those are the ones that get, they are detained by immigration officials, and then the immigration officials has 72 hours to determine where they're going to put the child. The child might stay in San Diego County at a facility here that's just for children, or they might be sent off to Houston or Seattle or some other facility around the nation. And all those kids have to go in front of a judge.
Yeah.
And I should say, for those that don't know, that in immigration, while you have a right to an attorney, you do not have a right to appointed counsel. And that also holds true for the children. So you see those images of the child who's in court by themselves, and they're having to address themselves to the judge. And by the way, there's opposing counsel from the government that is also presenting their case, their viewpoint. So that's where we step in. We provide the legal representation for those children. So that's one. The other one that you're mentioning is the separated families, and that was more evident. I want to say, you all heard about the incredible effort here in San Diego through the San Diego Rapid Response Network to have a migrant shelter to help these families that were being left on the street by themselves with small children, etc. Before that, there was a lot of the separation of the families, and there's a long probably explanation of the reason why they were separated.
Yeah.
We are still seeing some of these separations. We try to help reconnect parents with their children. And also, you heard in the news, not occurring here in San Diego County, but in Texas, where the federal agents were bypassing the whole process, the legal process of how to handle these unaccompanied children, and were instead taking them to a hotel, holding them there, and then removing them without an opportunity, again, to be heard and have. So it's, I guess my theme is the importance of the rule of law, the importance of due process, and the importance, regardless of the immigration status or the age of the individual, to have an opportunity to be heard. They have a right to apply for whatever the law dictates that they can apply for, and have the adjudicator determine if the person is eligible, found to be credible, and would in fact grant them that kind of protection, adults or children. So I just wanted to emphasize that to me is so incredibly critical in all of this. And of course, we've seen a constriction of all of that. So a little bit of the breadth of what it is for the children. And of course, why are children fleeing?
Yeah.
What is going on in their home country that they have put themselves in this circumstance?
Yeah.
What is going on in this mother's mind of having to choose between life and death, and even having to make some kind of arrangements of having somebody bring their child to what they think is going to be safe or safer?
Or I've heard stories of parents having to choose between children as to which one will, be given which opportunity to migrate, and which one will, which ones they'll keep with them, and which ones they'll, send out on their own. I mean, these kinds of, like you say, life and death decisions that are forced upon people under extreme circumstances. Your comment about the rule of law also makes me reflect on this, what I've experienced. Perhaps I'm interested to hear your experience that, often these federal agencies and facilities are incredibly opaque and difficult to get inside of or work with. I think of the detention center. You mentioned that you all work with the detention center here in San Diego. Has that been, has that been easy to get access to, your clients at Casa Cornelia who are in detention? And are those kinds of relationships facilitated, or do you find you have to kind of, work your way in or around and bang on doors to get in to represent your clients who are being detained in these facilities?
Right. So there's an adult detention facility in Otay Mesa. All of you have heard of it. That's where the majority of our adult asylum seeking clients are detained. And well, it's a relationship that has been cultivated, fostered, and encouraged for the last 27 years.
Yeah.
So we've been around for a little bit, and being able to gain the trust, and for either the courts or the detention officials to know that the cases that we're handling are cases that we are advocating for and we are putting forth. So yes, we do have access to the detention facility to be able to interview them. However, with all the COVID circumstance, and you heard the reports that there were some individuals that actually were uh, COVID affected. In other words, they got infected. They got COVID.
Yeah.
It makes it much more difficult. Within the detention facility in Otay Mesa, there is a courtroom within the facility. That one was closed, and the judges transferred themselves over to the downtown immigration court there on Front Street. So so those court hearings have continued, but they're not in the detention facility. So it's been more difficult, and trying to get a hold of them. You know, when you're representing someone in court, you have to review the facts. You're trying to understand the client. If they're speaking a different language that you don't speak, you're using an interpreter. Any documents they may have brought with them need to be reviewed. They have to review their entire application. An application for asylum, withholding of removal, or UN Convention Against Torture cases, because we normally ask for all three. We're talking about a very substantive stack of papers that has to be prepared, both subjective and objective evidence to advocate that the client's story is credible, the client themselves are credible, and why they are deserving and meritorious of asylum and related protection. So it's quite an endeavor to represent one defensive asylum case. It depends on the speed of things, but it could easily take from 100 to 150 attorney hours of putting that application together. It's intense. It's an intense, and we're very fortunate that being able to extend ourselves beyond our staff attorneys, we work with a cadre of very committed volunteer attorneys from the private bar here in San Diego that take these cases to heart, and they take them all the way through. And oftentimes, if not successful, they commit themselves to doing the appeal. And so we also do a lot of appellate work all the way up to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. I've argued a few cases myself, and so it's something that we're extremely passionate about of putting forth. So, but you know what? Relationship has been really important. There's been a little bit more under the current administration of a closing of doors, not being as communicative in regards to that. And so other groups have had to take legal action, for instance, against the detention facility, in order to be able to extrapolate the information to try to ensure the health and safety of those that are detained.
Yeah, that's in my work. We've had a longstanding relationship through our Friends of Friendship Park Coalition with San Diego Border Patrol. And a big part of that we've learned is that it's just been a revolving door of people. You know, they're changing, they're shifting assignments all the time. Administrations change, and then you have a new, so you kind of feel like you're building a continuous conversation and some relationship. And then all of a sudden we go to another meeting and it's a whole new, you know, a whole new group of people. I feel like we're starting all over. But it sounds like you've been able to have some consistency. That detention center there has now been in San Diego for, is it 2 decades? The Donovan, it's somewhere around there, isn't it? Or has it been there as long as you've been at Casa?
Well, originally it used to be called Camp Barrett. And then, there was always a little detention facility there at the border. I mean, something other unique that's been happening across the nation has been the privatization of detention facilities and prisons. So currently, the detention facility used to be called CCA, Corrections Corporation of America. That transferred over to a new corporate name, same folks, but now it's called Core Civic. So they contract with the federal government to manage and to have the facility. So they have their own guards, etc. That facilitate it. You know, I would be remiss to share with the group that there's another group of people that we help. And that's the undocumented victim of serious crime that are not detained. They're in our communities here in San Diego, in our border region, that have suffered domestic violence, sexual assault, kidnapping, rape, human trafficking, and are working with law enforcement to prosecute or investigate the crime. We handle those cases as well. So there's special visas that are available under the UT and the Violence Against Women Act. I would be remiss not to mention them as well. So those are our three focus.
Thank you for that, Carmen, and thank you for your work. Yeah. Well, listen, before we sign off, I do want to ask, because it's in the news, the theme of this series is what's in the news, and what's in the news, today is very much the presidential debate, the first presidential debate tonight. I don't know, does this, whether it causes you to groan or makes you anxious, or all the various reactions that we have to these, to national politics, the things that are of great consequence to our border communities. How are you all? Are you planning to watch the debate tonight? And will you be with a stiff shot of whiskey, or what's your strategy for navigating this perilous month of politics that's coming up? Jim, do you have any plans for the coming weeks? How you hanging in?
Yeah, I'm a political junkie, and so I wouldn't miss it for anything. Yeah. And right now, I think from my perspective, things look pretty good.
Yeah. So you're just sort of hoping for the best, and
hoping for the best, and hoping that those revelations about taxes not paid keep coming out.
Yeah, that's shocking. That's shocking stuff. I have several friends. Actually, I don't know. So I'm looking at our friend Robert Vivar in Tijuana. I have a couple of friends deported folks in Tijuana who just posted this morning. I paid more in taxes than Trump did. They were deported in Mexico. Yeah, working for U.S. companies and paying more in taxes than the president of the United States. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what to do about all that other than groan. Yeah. How about you, Carmen? Are you following the politics, or do you just keep eyes on the prize and focused on your work? Case by case. How do you handle all the political storms that roil around us here in the border?
Well, my job is to keep a focus on everything. So obviously in the work, there's always a focus of one case, one life at a time.
Yeah.
Why? Because the enormity of the human suffering and the need is so large that to absorb it all would be very overwhelming, and then you become ineffective. So really trying to stay really focused on the prize, obviously with an eye towards what is the federal government doing, with an eye towards the elections. It's something that we, of course, as an organization, and we're not alone, as an organization are doing planning and strategic planning and trying to see potential outcomes of the elections. Yeah. And it's not an easy picture. I will be watching the debate. Yeah. So I think that there's going to be a lot they're going to be debating about. Yeah. And I hope that the truth is highlighted, reinforced, and emphasized, which can often get, I don't know, kind of pushed to the side. So that's what I'm hoping for.
I've mentioned before in this series, I'll mention again that I'm kind of surprised, in 2016, Trump, President Trump virtually branded his campaign with the border wall. I mean, it was almost like the logo for his campaign. Whereas this year, because there's so much else going on, I mean, taxes and COVID and all this other stuff, the border hasn't, and immigration hasn't, I don't think it's on the agenda for tonight. I saw a list of questions, for instance. So it is interesting. Sometimes maybe I think that's good. I mean, if maybe sometimes I feel like, well, if the border is, it's better if they're not talking about it, not focused on it, and not sticking their foot in the mouth about it, or making promises that then will come back, turn out to be promises that can cause real harm. But yeah, well, and scenario planning, yes, as you're describing, Carmen, right? To imagine, and all these different possibilities, right? Depending on that composition of Congress, right, as well. Legislation that could be done or undone. The Supreme Court, presumptively a very conservative. Do you read that, Carmen, just quickly before we close? Do you read that as a conservative court when it comes to matters of immigration? I know I'm speaking in very broad terms, but what I read in the news is, oh, this is going to be a really conservative court. Does it look to you like it would also feel that way in terms of immigration policy, or is that too much to know?
No, it definitely feels that way, of kind of constricting the legal rights of those individuals, of whether it's asylum seekers or immigrants in general, DACA, the Dreamers.
Yeah.
I think all of those things, in effect, are on the table.
Yeah.
I should say that there's a lot of policy things going on right now, have been, and along with that, appointment of judges and federal agents and leaders of these immigration-related departments that have a direct impact on the way the law is executed. So that is ongoing, and that is happening right now as it relates to asylum seekers, it relates to special victims of crime, and their ability to be able to apply for protection, and even the way unaccompanied children are to be treated and brought through the process. So there is a profound effect on every single level. Not to mention those that have an employment-based or labor certification, the big corporations that bring in scientists from around the world. It's not my area, but that's also an affected area, which affects the economy and affects everything. And here in San Diego,
especially so, yes.
Especially so.
Yeah. Well, listen, Jim and Carmen, thank you both very, very much for joining me. If you're willing, we'll stick around a little bit and chat further here in Zoom. I just want to say to our Facebook audience that if you'd like to join us on Zoom, reach out to us at viainternational.org or viacafe.org, and we'll get you connected. And next week on this program, I know I'll be interviewing Karen Sobreros. Karen is a U.S. Citizen who now lives in Rosarito and is engaged in both commercial work, has opened a new coffee shop and is involved in international coffee trade, but also nonprofit and philanthropic work in the Rosarito area with a whole network of wonderful women. And so Karen will be one of our guests next week. We'll tell you more about that next time. And for now, thanks again for joining us from everybody here at Via International and the Via Cafe. Thanks for joining us. Hasta la próxima vez. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Más unidos que nunca, en un latido se eleva.